Hello, I'm Michael Lambert, a fellow in social inequalities here at Lancaster University, and today I'm asking about the research in inequalities that's being done as part of the centre. So can I begin by asking, who are you?
Yeah, I'm Ted Gutsche. I'm a senior lecturer in critical digital media practice here in the sociology department.
And what do you do?
Well, I deal with journalism studies. So I teach both the practice of journalisms, usually from a Western perspective, only because it's so difficult to talk about all the different dimensions and the unique aspects of journalisms elsewhere. So my students touch upon how things are different, usually through a Western lens, understanding that that Western lens is hegemonic and is a way to shape the way people should be thinking about journalism elsewhere. So really, it's a way for them to think about how maybe journalisms in China actually might be more autonomous than Westerners might think it is, because that Western lens is so strongly dominant in both research and scholarship.
And so how do you, both in terms of teaching and research, get under the skin of these bigger issues? Because it's an enormous subject to try and break down to its constituent elements. And so methodologically, analytically, sort of pedagogically, how do you go about doing that?
Well, a lot of my work is rooted in media anthropology. So it's trying to look at journalism as a force of power. It is not from a normative perspective of journalism's there to right wrongs or to identify truths, but it's actually to complicate and say journalism's present particular truths, ideological perspectives. So Thompson's meaning in the service of power, for instance. So within societies, it's looking at those dominant explanations for things from natural disasters to human-made disasters, some of them often one and the same, but also issues of crime, social deviance or perceptions of social deviance, all under the guise of understanding that journalism is pivotal to aspects of social control, no matter where it is in the world, but that normatively those journalisms might be presented a bit differently in terms of maybe how we're talking about notions of objectivity, or how we're talking about the rules and regulations and state-run mandates of how media systems can operate or should operate.
So from this, can you give me an example, perhaps one, of how your work intersects with this kind of broader issue of inequalities? I mean, I have a sense of this already from the way that you're talking about power and structure and these kind of larger issues, but if you can provide a solid example of sort of either a piece of work you've done, or that would kind of put this into perspective.
Sure. So with some of my master's students here a couple years ago, we worked on a paper that we've published looking at the use of hashtags in journalism in the United States when there were moments of the hashtag barbecue Becky, for instance. So there was and there continues to be a rash of white individuals, particularly white women, calling police on Black individuals or non-white individuals for just living their daily lives. And on social media, you had a movement of hashtag barbecue Becky, for instance, or hashtag Caroline or corner store Caroline, these instances that would categorize in social media narratives related to these particular events where police, which is a violent act, calling 911 actually for police is in of itself a violent act because of how police can operate, and they do operate. So calling 911, or here maybe 999, but particularly in the US context, calling police to just try and get a person out of your neighborhood that you don't like is a violent act because it will likely lead to violence by police. But we looked at how these hashtags were being used in journalism. And what we found was that it really was not just to categorize these stories and make them familiar to people so that people said, oh, these are some of the similar actions and stories and news events related to what we now refer to as maybe Karens of the world. Yeah. But it was actually a way to add moments of humor to diminish the actual violent acts that people were committing against non-white individuals in these stories. And it was a chance for us to see how whiteness operated in journalism by ignoring the complications of the term Becky, for instance, that as a moniker, as a nickname, as within the lexicon of some Black communities, particularly on Black Twitter, how that word Becky represents a particular individual with in treatments toward African American and Blacks in the United States. And so what we found from that was that journalism, not surprisingly, maintains its whiteness in that particular case through categorization, through methodological dismantlings of meanings and language by not going deep enough or by not being inclusive enough. And so that's just one example of how our students here at Lancaster, we work together to try to understand the complications of how journalism maintains that status quo, particularly through language and the technology and of language.
I think that's a really, really good example and a great exposition, both of the kind of collaborative way between teaching and research in bringing those two together, but also then looking, as you say, within the kind of Western normative, almost the assumed taken for granted way that a practice should operate, and kind of dismantling that and again bringing to bear both the theoretical and the empirical. So it's a really good example of how inequalities relates to your work. So can I finish by asking about your relationship to others outside the university, so groups, organizations, partners, stakeholders that you work with or alongside?
Well, one of the things that I'm really excited about is a podcast that I produce and host. It's called The J Word. It's a podcast that we do from the journal Journalism Practice, where I'm an associate editor. And what we do with that podcast is we identify early career researchers and researchers who may not be as well known throughout journalism studies. And we bring them together to have discussions about how their articles interact with each other. And I try to apply critical and cultural studies approaches to the conversation, which in the United States and US context, which unfortunately continues to dominate the world of journalism studies and the things that are studied and how they're explained and the ideologies that are assigned to journalistic practices, we try to we're a bit subversive, I think, by bringing in different voices, particularly voices of women and, again, early career researchers from other parts of the world than just Western geographies. And we talk about how journalists, citizens, scholars can look at the articles that these folks have written in a different lens, in a different way, how they can be applied. And for about a month after the podcast drops with those particular articles, those articles are made free access so that people can actually read the work of the scholarship. I've had scholars from parts of the world who haven't actually been able to access their own published scholarship until we were able to make it free access. So we're also trying to attack a bit of the corporatization of our scholarship and the corporate ownership behind some of our ideas. So that's just one of the things that I'm really excited about, where we're bringing in voices from hopefully a diverse range and certainly diverse ideological backgrounds, so that we can try and make some of this accessible, meaningful, and hopefully applicable to people beyond just those in the academy.
I think that's a great way to finish, talking about the inequalities which are kind of obtained in our day-to-day practice in doing research and those kinds of barriers, and how they're understood, interpreted, and felt on a global dynamic. And I think, again, from the examples you give and the kinds of things you're involved with, it's a real demonstration, that link between active practice and the kind of research that you do.
Great. I'm glad that helps.
Thank you very much for taking the time to me today to talk about your work and its relationship to inequalities.
Great. Thank you.